He sat at the head of a polished dining table, staring at a single untouched wine glass, her glass catching the last bit of evening light. The roast had gone cold hours ago. The candle beside it trembled, though the windows were closed, as if the room itself couldn't hold still anymore. Outside, the city hummed with Friday night life, but in that quiet Seattle condo, the silence between two people who once promised forever felt heavier than the storm clouds gathering over the bay. Claire Dawson had dressed for her birthday dinner. She'd waited, she'd hoped, and then, slowly, she'd blown out her candle alone. A man like Michael Dawson could sign million-dollar contracts without blinking, yet somehow missed the one thing that should have mattered most, showing up. The strange thing about this night wasn't the empty chair across from her. It was the way she finally looked at it, as if realizing she'd been sitting alone far longer than just one evening. If you've ever loved someone so much that you didn't notice yourself disappearing, this story might feel familiar. Let's begin. The roast was cooling on the counter, its scent drifting through the kitchen like a reminder of time slipping away. 3 candles leaned in softened wax, their flames small and wavering, and the second wine glass sat untouched at the end of the table. Claire Dawson stood beside it, fingertips resting lightly on the rim, as though the glass might warm at the promise of a hand that never came. Outside, the Seattle skyline glowed in dusky shades of blue and amber, the kind of evening that once made her feel hopeful and alive. But tonight, at 38, she felt the quiet weight of the hour settling on her shoulders. She adjusted one of the plates she had set out with careful attention, as if straightening it might steady the tremor in her chest. Her phone buzzed. She didn't need to read the message to know what it said. The familiar mix of apology and distance had become a kind of script. When she finally picked it up, the words were short, efficient, sterile, running late. I'm sorry. She stared at the message a moment longer than necessary. A part of her wondered if he had typed it on instinct, the way someone ties their shoes without thinking. Michael Dawson, her husband of 4 years, used to write her entire paragraphs, thoughts, jokes, little check-ins. Now their exchanges felt like reminders left on a fridge, functional, cold, and meant for anyone, not her. She set the phone face down. In the reflection on the window, she caught a glimpse of herself, the soft waves of her brown hair resting on one shoulder, the simple navy dress she wore, because he once said it brought out the warmth in her eyes. She stood in a kitchen glowing with dim lights and quiet hope. A woman who had cooked a full birthday dinner for 2 and ended up alone. When the doorbell rang, she startled. For a tiny second, her heart lifted. She knew better, but hope had never been logical. It wasn't Michael, of course. It was the grocery delivery she had almost forgotten she ordered earlier that afternoon. A tall young man in his mid-20s held out the bag toward her, cheeks reddened from the cold wind outside. Sorry if I'm interrupting anything, he said, glancing at the candles behind her. Looks like a dinner. His awkward politeness made her smile in spite of herself. It was supposed to be... Oh. His shoulders lowered a little, as if he understood more than he meant to. Well, happy, whatever the occasion is. My birthday, she said softly. He froze. Oh. Wow. Happy birthday. She thanked him and took the bag, expecting him to leave right away. But he hesitated a moment longer, shifting nervously. He seemed like the kind of kid who apologized even when he hadn't done anything wrong. Hope someone shows up, he said, then grimaced at his own words. I mean, well, you know, Claire let out a small, warm laugh, touched by his sincerity. It's all right. Jake. His name tag made him blink in surprise. Most people don't read those. Most people don't say the right thing accidentally, she replied. He laughed under his breath. For a moment, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt all evening, simple human connection. As he turned to leave, she heard herself say, "Wait." He looked back. She didn't know why the words came out. She only knew that the apartment felt unbearably quiet, and the cake she'd baked looked far too large for one person. Do you want a slice of birthday cake, she asked. Just cake. Nothing weird. I don't want to eat alone. Jake blinked, stunned, then nodded with the uncertain politeness of someone raised to never refuse kindness. Sure. Yeah, if you're okay with that. They sat at the table together, her at the head, him along the side, leaving her husband's empty chair untouched. She lit a single candle on the cake, though it felt a little silly now. Jake clapped lightly when she blew it out, cheeks lifting in a shy smile. Conversation came easily. He told her about working 2 part-time jobs, about taking evening classes, about missing his mother's cooking in Montana. She shared pieces of her day, careful not to reveal too much, though her loneliness seeped through in the pauses. The laughter they exchanged was small and cautious, but real. It warmed something inside her that had been cold for months. A moment later, she reached for her phone without thinking. "Smile," she said, holding it out between them. Jake laughed, startled. "Seriously?" "Just one," she said. For proof I didn't spend the whole evening with a roast and a pity party. They leaned in. She lifted the phone. For the briefest second, the apartment felt alive again. 2 people mid-laugh, shoulders touching lightly, a slice of cake between them. The shutter clicked. She stared at the photo longer than she expected. Her smile looked easy, unguarded, a version of herself she hadn't seen in months. Before she could second-guess it, her thumb hovered over the post button. She typed a simple caption, half joking, half true, and pressed upload. A pulse of adrenaline went through her. It wasn't spite. It wasn't revenge. It was the feeling of stepping outside a cage you didn't realize you'd built around yourself. Jake left soon after, thanking her again and wishing her a better rest of the night. When the door closed, the silence returned, but it carried a different weight now, like a breath held too long. She sat alone at the table once more, candles burning low, the empty chair still untouched. Her phone buzzed again on the table, lighting up the wood with soft, white light. She hesitated before reaching for it, because for the first time all evening, she wasn't sure she wanted to know who might have seen the truth she'd just released into the world. Claire didn't fall out of love. She just slowly disappeared from her own life. That thought circled in her mind the morning after her birthday, drifting in and out like the weak winter light slipping past the blinds. She sat at the kitchen counter, a mug of lukewarm tea cupped between her hands, watching steam fade before it fully formed. The apartment was still, filled with the soft hum of the refrigerator and nothing else. It was a silence she knew too well. Seattle felt colder after last night. Or maybe it was just the weight of remembering how she ended up here in the first place. 3 years ago, she had left a small Oregon town where the rain smelled of cedar and people remembered your name at the grocery store. She had left her job as an art therapist, a modest house with peeling paint, and the comfort of routine. She left because Michael had looked at her with a kind of gentleness she hadn't expected from a man who carried so much loss. He had been widowed for 2 years when they met a quiet man with careful eyes and a posture that suggested he was holding more than he knew how to share. He listened well. He remembered small details. He laughed softly, like it surprised him each time. Back then, he felt like steady ground. Moving to Seattle had seemed like stepping into a bigger, fuller life, a place where she could start again, maybe even open a small studio once she settled. They talked about it during weekend drives, or in long conversations over wine, when he still made time for things like that. She believed him when he said he wanted a future where both of them could grow. But after the wedding, that gentleness began to thin around the edges. Michael slid back into the rhythm of Dawson tech, like a man returning to an old addiction reports, travel schedules, late-night calls, meetings that never seemed to end. At first he apologized, then he explained. Eventually, he simply assumed she understood. Her world shrank without either of them noticing. The art therapy position she planned to pursue had been delayed when the center lost funding. Her adult daughter lived 2 states away in Colorado, busy with her sophomore year of college. Friends back in Oregon called, less as life swept them forward. Claire didn't blame them. She just didn't know how to keep up. Some mornings, she found herself standing at the window, hair unbrushed, watching ferries glide across the Sound, while the apartment sat untouched behind her. Noon would arrive before she realized she hadn't spoken a single word aloud. Other days, she tried to make their home feel alive. She cooked. She rearranged shelves. She bought small plants she hoped might thrive better than she felt she was. But every evening ended the same, a quiet apartment, a dinner growing cold, and a message from Michael that blurred into routine. Running late. Don't wait up. Rain check. She kept every message, every rain check. The small hurts weren't dramatic. They were subtle, almost invisible, an unopened jar she couldn't reach on the top shelf because he had placed it there without thinking, a text she drafted 3 times before sending, only to receive a one-word reply. The way he kissed her hello without really looking at her, the empty chair across from her each night. One afternoon, she found an old sketchbook while cleaning. The pages smelled faintly of graphite and coffee. Her drawings of past clients were still there, soft shadows forming faces full of stories. She traced a line with her fingertip, her chest tightening. She had once been needed, useful, seen. Now she felt like a guest wandering the halls of someone else's life. By evening, the apartment was washed in a pale glow. Michael had texted again another late night. Claire placed her phone face down, unwilling to read the words twice. She microwaved leftover pasta, ate standing at the counter, and let the silence settle around her shoulders. Later, she sat on the couch, laptop open on her knees. She wasn't looking for anything specific, just browsing, the way someone looks through windows at houses they know they can't afford. But then she clicked into a listing for a tiny apartment in Ballard, exposed brick, old hardwood floors, just big enough for one person. A little dim, a little worn, but alive with character. She stared at the photos longer than she meant to. She clicked to another listing, then another. Downtown efficiencies, studio lofts near Pike Place, smaller places tucked beneath trees in neighborhoods she'd never visited. She wasn't sure if she was searching for space or air. Her pulse fluttered at the realization she had been imagining escape. Not seriously, not with bags packed or plans made, but imagining the simple possibility of waking somewhere that didn't hurt. Her cursor hovered over a button that said, "Request a tour." The tiny blue link felt louder than the room around her. She closed the laptop quickly, as though it had asked a question she wasn't ready to answer. Outside, the city lights flickered against the glass. She pressed the heel of her hand to her forehead, breathing slowly, trying to settle the swirl inside her. Leaving wasn't a decision she could even name yet. Maybe she just wanted proof she still had a choice. But as she turned off the lamp and the living room slipped into darkness, the question lingered quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. Was she truly considering walking away, or was she just trying to remember what freedom felt like? The photo wasn't meant for him, but it found him anyway. It glowed from the screen like a tiny spark dropped into a room soaked in gasoline. Michael Dawson stared at it, frozen. The soft buzz of Dawson Tech's open office fading into a hollow hum around him. In the picture, Claire leaned in toward a young man at their dining table. Her smile was gentle, almost shy. A single candle burned behind them. The glow touched her face the way he hadn't in months. His throat tightened. "Rough night," Carolyn asked softly. She stood beside his desk, one hand hovering uncertainly over her tablet. Her gaze flicked toward the screen, then away, giving him the courtesy of pretending she hadn't brought it to him on purpose. Before he could form a response, another coworker passing by let out a low laugh. "Man, your wife celebrates better than you do." The comment was casual, thrown like a paper ball, but it hit like a fist to the ribs. Michael shut the laptop a little too fast. The crack of the hinge made Carolyn flinch. He didn't apologize. He couldn't. His pulse was too loud in his ears, drowning thoughts before they fully formed. He didn't know what he felt first, jealousy or dread. They tangled together, sharp and breath-stealing. She posted it about an hour ago. Carolyn continued, her voice gentle, cautious. It's getting attention." He exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs with a thin edge. "Thank you," he said, though his voice sounded distant to his own ears. When she walked away, He opened the laptop again. He zoomed in on her face. There was a softness there he hadn't seen in a long time, a softness he used to think belonged to him. But he wasn't there last night. Again. His jaw tightened. For a flicker of a moment, he felt anger rise irrational, instant. Who was that guy? Why was he in their home? What was she doing posting a picture like that? The questions came fast, fueled by the sting of embarrassment and the echo of his coworker's joke. But beneath that first flare of instinctive defensiveness, something heavier began to push through. A memory Claire standing at the kitchen window, still wearing her apron because she waited for him too long. Another, her voice on the phone, light but tired, asking if he'd be home by 8. And another, the number of dinners he'd missed in the last 5 months, more than he could count without opening their calendar. His throat ached for the first time in years. Michael really wondered what she felt when he didn't show up. He leaned back in his chair, pressing a hand to his mouth. The office around him buzzed with keyboards, muted chatter, and the low hum of productivity. It all felt miles away. He tried to rationalize maybe she was being dramatic. Maybe she was trying to get his attention, but the look on her face in that picture wasn't staged. It was real joy, real warmth. Warmth she hadn't given him in months, maybe because he hadn't given her anything to warm up to. He closed the laptop again, slower this time, as if the movement itself forced him to reckon with something he'd been ignoring. A meeting request blinked on his phone, an investment dinner he'd been preparing for all week. A multi-million-dollar contract. His team depended on him. Usually, the weight of responsibility steadied him. Tonight, it landed differently, like a chain instead of a duty. He stood abruptly. A junior manager looked up. "Sir, the restaurant your driver is downstairs. Cancel it," Michael said. The room fell quiet in a way he didn't like eyes lifting, whispers barely concealed. Dawson Tech rarely saw him break routine. He was the man who never canceled, never faltered, never deviated. His predictability had been a kind of armor, but at that moment, the only thing he could think of was Claire's smile aimed at someone else. In the home he kept missing, on the night he should have been there. He grabbed his coat. "Sir, should I reschedule?" the manager asked. "I said cancel," he repeated, sharper than intended. As he stepped into the cold Seattle air, the wind catching the edges of his coat, he paused at the curb. His chest felt tight with something he didn't want to name. The city lights blurred slightly, as though refusing to sharpen until he faced the truth he'd been avoiding. Was he rushing home to fix things, or to accuse her? The question hit him harder than he expected, because he didn't know the answer, not yet. But he knew this. Whatever waited behind their front door tonight would demand something from him he hadn't offered in a long time, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Michael drove through the rain as if speed could outrun regret. The wipers dragged across the windshield in frantic strokes, but nothing cleared the blur pressing against his vision. Downtown lights streaked past him, thin and distorted, as though the entire city were refusing to steady itself long enough for him to think straight. He kept seeing the photo, her smile, that stranger, the single candle behind them, her birthday candle, the one he should have been there to light. Questions tumbled in his chest, each sharper than the last. He rehearsed sentences that didn't sound like accusations, then discarded them when they slipped too close to blame. He heard versions of his own voice asking, "Who is he?" Then a second voice asking, "Why weren't you there?" Neither voice felt like the man he wanted to be. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. By the time he pulled into the garage beneath their building, his pulse had steadied into something colder, apprehension mixed with a thin thread of fear. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, or what he was ready to hear. Upstairs, in the quiet condo overlooking the Sound, Claire moved through the morning with a slowness that mirrored a bruise forming under the skin. Soft light filtered through the windows, outlining the remnants of her birthday like a still life she didn't remember painting. She blew out the last of the candles, gathered the empty plates, wrapped the cake they barely touched. Every movement felt like cleaning up after a party she never attended. She considered leaving the table, as it was a silent exhibit of last night's truth, but the sight of it made her chest pull tight. She'd spent years trying to make their home feel warm. She couldn't bear staring at a scene that only echoed her loneliness. On the counter near the sink sat her phone. The post was still there. She tapped the screen with hesitant fingers. Opening it again, the photo filled the display, brighter than she remembered. Her own smile startled her, a small, genuine curve she hadn't seen from herself in months. The comments were climbing. Friends back home, her daughter with a simple heart emoji, a few strangers wishing her happy birthday. Nothing malicious, nothing dramatic, just the quiet acknowledgement that someone out there had seen her, maybe more than her husband had lately. Her thumb hovered over the option to delete. If she removed it now, it would be as though last night never happened. The ache, the brief warmth, the shift inside her she couldn't quite name. But she didn't delete it. Instead, she locked the screen and set the phone aside, feeling the finality of the choice ripple through her. On the opposite end of the counter lay a folded rental brochure she'd tucked into her purse weeks ago, back when the thought of leaving was nothing more than a fleeting curiosity. Last night, in the quiet after Jake left and the emptiness settled back around her, she unfolded it again. She'd traced the picture of the tiny Ballard apartment with her thumb, imagining the weight of her own breath in a place that belonged only to her. Now, she folded it once more and left it on the counter, not out of spite, not as a threat, but as a quiet acknowledgement of her own limits. If things didn't change, she needed to know she had somewhere to go. She stood there a long time, palms pressed to the cool marble, breathing through the ache in her chest. She wasn't trying to punish him. She wasn't even trying to scare him. She was simply preparing herself for confrontation, for truth, for the possibility that love wasn't enough anymore. The elevator dinged down the hallway. Claire straightened, her pulse fluttering. She smoothed her hair, though she wasn't sure why. Old habits of wanting to appear calm, composed, reasonable, habits born from years of filling silence with grace and hoping someone would meet her halfway. The door opened. Michael stepped inside, Rain still clinging to his shoulders, his breath uneven, eyes searching for her before he fully crossed the threshold. She stood by the counter, hands resting lightly against its edge. Neither spoke. For a moment, the only sound was the rain softening against the windows. Then his gaze dropped to the counter, where the folded rental brochure sat like an unspoken sentence between them. He froze. His jaw worked once, then again, as though words formed but refused to leave. Claire watched him carefully, her own breath caught somewhere between resolve and sorrow. She didn't move toward him, didn't defend herself, didn't fill the silence for his comfort. He reached for the brochure with a slow, tentative hand. The paper crinkled softly as he unfolded it. When he looked up at her, his expression held a question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. And she knew this moment, this breath, this silence would mark something irreversible, no matter what came next. Who as he wasn't the question that mattered. It was everything underneath it. Those 4 words hung between them the moment Michael looked up from the rental brochure. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the strain of someone holding too much inside for too long. Rain tapped softly against the windows behind him, a steady, fragile rhythm that marked the silence Claire refused to break first. She stepped back from the counter just slightly, enough to breathe. "He was the delivery kid," she said quietly. "He brought groceries? That's all?" Michael's jaw tightened. Not disbelief, not quite, but something closer to wounded pride. "You took a picture with him." "It was my birthday," she answered, the words steady despite the tremble in her hands. "I didn't want to eat alone." The sentence landed in the space between them like a slow, heavy stone. Michael blinked, as though trying to process that simplicity, that sadness. "Claire, you could have told me you were upset." She gave a soft, disbelieving laugh. "I have told you. For months." His shoulders stiffened. "I've been working. You know what this quarter meant for the company. I know what it meant for you," she corrected gently. "But what did it mean for us?" He looked away, the muscles at the back of his neck tightening. "I'm doing this for our future. Our future has no present left," she whispered. The room felt smaller then, the ceiling lower, the walls too close. Michael moved a hand across his face, rubbing the fatigue from his eyes. You're blowing this out of proportion. Claire's breath caught a painful, sharp inhale. That's not fair. He looked up, startled by the firmness in her tone. She stepped closer, just enough to force him to truly see her. You don't come home, she said. You don't call. You don't respond unless it's convenient. I go to sleep alone. I wake up alone. I eat dinner alone. Do you know when I stopped setting a second plate? Her voice cracked, not dramatic, just tired in a way that carried years. 3 months ago, Michael opened his mouth, but she lifted a hand not to silence him harshly, but to keep the dam from breaking too fast. That boy last night, he wasn't anyone. She continued softly. He apologized for interrupting, and it was the first time all day someone spoke to me like I existed. She let her eyes meet his. Do you understand how humiliating that is? At 38, in my own home, on my birthday, he exhaled shakily, guilt slipping into the spaces jealousy had occupied minutes before. I didn't know it was this bad. You didn't want to know? He flinched not outwardly, but in the slight way his breath hitched. Claire swallowed, then said what she'd been carrying for far too long. You stopped asking how I was. You stopped noticing when I was hurting. I would send you messages, and I'd wait, watching the clock. Sometimes I'd stare at the door like a fool, thinking maybe you'd surprise me, but you didn't. The truth held no anger now, only exhaustion. I felt invisible. Michael, not unloved, maybe, but unseen. A sharp silence pressed in. He took a step toward her, but stopped halfway, as though unsure he had the right. I never meant to hurt you, he said, voice low. I thought, that working hard was enough, she asked softly. That money could fill the space where you should have been. He lowered his eyes. Claire's fingers twisted around the edge of her sweater, grounding herself. I'm not angry about the hours. I'm angry about how easily you gave them everything, while giving us nothing. A pulse of defensiveness flickered across his face, but he didn't say what she expected. Instead, why didn't you tell me you were looking at apartments? She held his gaze. Because I wasn't sure I'd ever be brave enough to leave. His breath caught. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't plan anything. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't even choose a place. But I needed to know I had somewhere to go if what he asked, fear bleeding into the question. If we reached the point where silence felt safer than staying, the room felt colder. He took another step forward, expression twisting, part remorse, part disbelief. Claire, tell me you're not thinking of walking away? Her lips parted, but she didn't answer immediately, not out of cruelty, out of truth. She looked at the counter, at the brochure he'd unfolded with trembling hands. She looked at the table where she'd sat alone the night before. And she looked at him, the man she had loved, the man she still loved, but the man who had left her alone in the same room for nearly 5 months. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. I've thought about leaving. The sentence didn't echo. It simply existed solid, undeniable, transforming the space around them. Michael closed his eyes as though bracing for impact, his breath catching on the inhale. For the first time, she saw fear in him. Real fear. The kind that came from realizing you'd been asleep at the wheel while something precious drifted toward the edge. He opened his eyes slowly. The softness there, startling. Claire, he whispered. But the rest of the sentence failed him. She waited. But he didn't speak. Not yet. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know whether to fight for her, or withdraw into the familiar armor that had cost them so much already. And she could see that battle starting behind his eyes. Silence can be louder than shouting, especially in a condo made of glass. The morning after their confrontation, Claire stood in the doorway of the guest room, her hands resting lightly on the suitcase she hadn't fully packed. She didn't slam doors, didn't drag anything across the floor. She simply lifted a folded blanket from the linen closet and placed it at the foot of the smaller bed, her movements quiet enough to feel deliberate. The soft hum of the city rose through the windows, But even that seemed muted compared to the silence stretching between their rooms. Michael watched from down the hall. He didn't speak, didn't know how to. He had spent his entire marriage believing that silence was safer than the wrong words. And now, silence felt like the very thing tearing them apart. When she disappeared behind the guest room door, the soft click of the latch echoed like something final. He tried returning to work, opening his laptop on the dining table. The screen glowed with numbers, emails, proposals waiting for approval. Words blurred, lines moved. He blinked hard, trying to focus. But every few seconds his eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward the closed door where she now slept. He had been good at this, once compartmentalizing work here, emotions sealed off in some unreachable place. But today, he couldn't find the switch. The condo felt too bright, the wide windows letting in the winter sun with a clarity that made everything feel exposed. He let out a breath, rubbed the back of his neck, and tried again. But the spreadsheet in front of him refused to behave. His fingers hovered above the keys, then dropped. He pushed the laptop closed, the sound too loud in the stillness. A memory surfaced before he could stop it. He was 8. His mother stood in the kitchen, still dressed in her navy business suit, the one with the gold buttons she polished every Sunday. She didn't look up when he entered. He had drawn a picture at school that day, a lighthouse in red crayon, with little stick figure waves crashing around it. He'd wanted to show her. Not now. "Michael," she had said, her eyes fixed on a stack of papers. "Put it on the counter. I'll see it later." She never did. He had forgotten the picture for years, until he found it decades later, tucked behind a drawer, edges curled, never once touched. The memory pressed against him now, heavier than it had ever been. He leaned back in the chair, running a hand over his face. Was that what Claire felt like, something he meant to notice someday? When life wasn't so busy, he closed his eyes, the ache settling in, patterns. He'd sworn he would never turn into his mother's kind of lonely. Yet here he was, repeating her silence, her distance, her practicality that left no room for tenderness. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, watching the drizzle collect on the glass. People moved along the sidewalks below, holding umbrellas, rushing to buses, laughing as the wind pushed against them. Strangers moving with purpose, with connection. He felt like a stranger in his own life. Down the hall, he heard a faint sound, Claire opening a drawer, maybe moving a book, maybe simply existing behind a barrier he had helped build. His chest tightened. He thought about knocking. Just knock, just bridge the distance. But his feet didn't move. Instead, he returned to the dining table and lowered himself into the chair, staring at the dark surface where the birthday candles had stood just a night ago. He pressed his palms together, resting them against his forehead. His breath slowed, became heavier. He couldn't shake the image of her eyes when she said she'd thought about leaving. Not angry, not spiteful, just tired. The kind of tired that didn't heal overnight. He reached for his phone without meaning to. It sat beside his laptop, screen dark, case worn slightly at the corners. He lifted it, thumb brushing the edge, a small gesture, almost nothing but his heart beat faster. Call her, text her, say something. He stared at her name on the screen. Claire, so simple, so familiar, and somehow so far away now. He could tell her he was sorry. He could tell her he didn't want her to sleep in another room. He could tell her he didn't know how to fix this. But he wanted to try. The words hovered in his mind, faint but present. His thumb hovered over the call button. Just touch it. For a moment, he swore he felt warmth rising in his chest, the beginning of something fragile. Courage or desperation. He wasn't sure which. His heartbeat thudded, loud as a knock in an empty room. He inhaled, steadying himself. And then he set the phone down. Not because he didn't want to call, but because something inside him whispered that saying the wrong thing now could undo whatever thin thread still connected them. For the first time, he was afraid not of confrontation, but of losing her entirely. He sat back, staring at the device lying face up on the table, her name still glowing faintly. The drizzle outside thickened, turning the city skyline into a blurred watercolor. He wondered whether courage always felt this much like fear. Down the hall, he heard the soft creak of the guest room floor as she moved. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint sound of her footsteps, two people moving through the same home like strangers, each one afraid to open the door first. He lifted the phone again, held it, just held it. But he still didn't press call, and he couldn't answer the question rising in his chest. Was he capable of choosing vulnerability over the habits that had shaped him his entire life? The smell of something burning drifted down the hallway before Claire even stepped out of the guest room. It carried a mix of panic and effort, two things she had almost never associated with Michael. She paused, one hand brushing the doorknob, listening to the faint shuffle of his footsteps in the kitchen and the clang of a metal pan hitting the counter. She exhaled slowly. The sound was almost a sigh, almost a question. Through the open doorway, she saw a thin trail of smoke rising toward the ceiling, curling like a hesitant hand waving for attention. She blinked at it, unsure if she should feel alarmed or strangely touched. The billionaire had burned the mashed potatoes, and it might have been the most sincere thing he'd done in years. She stepped into the hallway, drawn by the unfamiliar scent of char and butter. The condo, usually pristine and perfectly controlled, looked softer tonight, almost human. As she approached the kitchen, she saw him standing by the stove, sleeves rolled up, a dish towel slung over his shoulder, like he had watched a 10-second tutorial and believed it qualified him for the job. He didn't notice her. His brow furrowed. He leaned over a mixing bowl, muttering something under his breath as he tried to salvage what looked like, well, something that used to be potatoes. Claire waited a moment before speaking. "Everything okay in here?" Michael startled, turning too quickly and nearly knocking over the bowl. The instinctive apology in his eyes flickered before he managed a weak smile. "I was trying to make dinner." She let her gaze drift slowly across the counter. Two trays sat cooling, one held a slightly lopsided meatloaf. The other, the remains of what had once been mashed potatoes, but now looked like a baked monument to determination gone wrong. Beside them rested several printed photographs, her small Oregon town, the clinic where she'd worked, and a picture of her daughter from last Christmas. The images were arranged in a neat line, as if he'd placed them there to remind himself of who she was, of the pieces of her life he had never fully held. A note lay on the counter, written in his careful handwriting. "Dinner, no phones, just us." Her chest tightened, the words brushing against a fragile place inside her. She traced them with her eyes, not touching the page, afraid it might undo her if she did. Michael shifted his weight, unsure. "Meatloaf was your favorite," he said softly. "Wasn't it? You mentioned it once, the night we signed the papers for the house." She remembered. She had talked about her mother's recipe while he scrolled through blueprints on his tablet. She had assumed he didn't hear her. Apparently, he had, or at least enough of it to try now. Emotion rose, quiet but undeniable. "I did mention it," she said. He nodded, relief flickering across his face for a moment before uncertainty washed it away. "I know I can't fix everything with dinner," he murmured, gesturing helplessly at the food. "But I needed to start somewhere." She looked at the burned potatoes, at the effort staining the edges of his shirt, at the photographs he had printed without knowing which ones mattered most. Something in her resisted a small voice reminding her this could be temporary, a gesture, a momentary attempt before he slipped back into old habits. She had seen cycles before, promises that wilted within a week, apologies that couldn't withstand routine. But she also saw the tremor in his hand as he wiped the counter, the way he glanced at her, then away, as if afraid of reading disappointment on her face, a man terrified he had waited too long. She crossed her arms, grounding herself. "Why now?" "Michael?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw clenched once before he answered. "Because last night, I heard you, really heard you, and I don't want to lose you." The words hung between them imperfect, late, but earnest. She took a breath, letting it settle. This was not a grand speech, not polished, not practiced, just him, stripped down to something real. Still, gestures could be deceiving. Hope was a dangerous thing to offer a woman who had lived with disappointment as routine. She glanced again at the note, then at the photos. One showed her daughter smiling under a tree outside her dorm. Another captured the small river running behind the clinic where she'd spent afternoons helping patients paint through grief. He had chosen each image deliberately, or maybe desperately. Either way, it softened something in her, but softness wasn't the same as trust. "You can't fix 5 months of silence with meatloaf," she said quietly. "I know." His voice cracked before he steadied it. "But maybe it can start a conversation." She closed her eyes for a moment, a long one. She let the stillness wash over her, settling between her ribs, weighing memory against possibility. When she opened them, he watched her with a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years, not since the early days, when they'd both been afraid to say the wrong thing. She looked toward the guest room, its door slightly ajar like an exit or a retreat. Then she looked back at him. Her hand touched the doorframe, fingers curling around the wood, as if weighing its comfort against the unknown waiting at the table. Finally, slowly, she stepped forward. Michael's breath caught, and she wondered if he even realized it. She reached the edge of the dining space, stopping just short of the table. A single candle burned there, crooked, slightly too short, melted unevenly. The flame wavered with a draft, fighting to stay alive. Something in that flicker felt painfully familiar. She pulled out the chair. She sat, but deep inside, one question lingered, trembling, unresolved. Was she walking toward healing or toward one last, quiet disappointment? The screen lit up before either of them had said their second sentence. The glow from Michael's phone cut across the dim dining room like a sharp blade, flashing against the candle glass, bright enough to pull Claire's breath tight inside her chest. It vibrated once, twice, the sound low but unmistakable, and in that instant, she felt the familiar rush of dread rising like cold water against her ribs. 5 months of empty dinners. 5 months of just one more call. 5 months of watching him choose everything except her. The flame on the table flickered as he reached toward the phone, its small light trembling like it understood exactly what was at stake. Claire didn't move. She watched his hand hover above the device, watched the familiar reflex in his fingertips, the one that had taken him away from her night after night, without apology, without even awareness. She waited for the pattern to repeat, for the quiet sting she knew too well, for the moment when this fragile attempt at dinner would collapse into another lonely evening. He glanced at the screen. She saw the name reflected in his eyes. Davenport Capital. A major investor. The kind he never ignored. The kind he let interrupt holidays, weekends, and once even the anniversary dinner he had forgotten until she gently reminded him. The meatloaf on her plate suddenly tasted like nothing at all. He reached for the phone. Claire lowered her gaze, waiting for the slip, for the disappointment to settle, for the silent agreement that she came after everything else. She pushed her fork aside and forced her breathing to steady, trying not to let the old ache resurface too quickly. Then the room went quiet. Not the quiet of abandonment, but a pause. She lifted her eyes. Michael's hand rested on the phone, but he wasn't picking it up. His shoulders were tense, as if he were holding 2 worlds apart with nothing but breath and bone. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she saw fear not of losing a deal, but of losing the moment right in front of him. The phone kept ringing, the vibration rattling softly against the wooden table. He didn't move. Slowly, deliberately. He put his hand flat over the screen, dimming its glow with the shadow of his palm. His thumb hovered near the power button. She could see the war happening behind his eyes. Responsibility pulling at one side, regret tugging at the other. He looked at her, not past her, not through her, at her. And Claire felt the air shift. "Michael?" Her voice came out softer than she expected, an echo of old wounds. "If you need to take it," He cut her off with a quiet inhale, almost a tremor. I don't. The word hung in the space between them, light but heavy, as if it carried months of unspoken apologies. The phone buzzed again, insistent. He pressed the side button. The screen went black. The silence that followed wasn't the suffocating kind. It was warm, tentative, like the first stillness after a storm when the world tries to breathe again. He slid the phone across the table, far from both of them, and rested his hands together. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, strained, and startlingly honest. You matter more than this call. Claire felt something inside her go still, as if her heart, weary from years of waiting, had suddenly paused to understand the meaning of a single choice. She stared at him, searching for signs of performance, for a crack in the gesture, but there was nothing polished in his expression, nothing practiced, just a man choosing to stay seated in front of her when everything in his life had trained him to stand up and leave. Do you? She asked softly. He blinked, startled by the question but not offended. If anything, it grounded him. He leaned back slightly, the candlelight drawing the lines of exhaustion at the corners of his eyes. Yes. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I just never showed it. The honesty struck her harder than the alternative. It wasn't apology wrapped in excuses. It wasn't a promise meant to soothe. It was simply truth, stripped down and vulnerable. For a moment, neither spoke. The candle crackled. Rain tapped faintly against the glass walls. Somewhere outside, a ferry horn echoed across Elliott Bay, distant and mournful. They were two people sitting across from each other, staring at a life that could still shift in either direction. She lifted her fork again, more to steady her hands than to eat. This is surprising, she said, her voice a mix of relief and fear. But one dinner doesn't erase everything. His nod was slow, almost solemn. I know, and I know you're waiting for me to slip back into old habits. She didn't deny it. Claire, I can't promise perfection. His eyes softened. But I can promise presence. Real presence. Starting tonight. Her breath trembled, caught somewhere between wanting to believe him and wanting to protect herself from hope that came too easily. Around them, the condo seemed to quiet down, as if listening. Michael lifted a small photo from the stack and set it gently near her plate. It was her daughter, smiling, carefree, lit by the Oregon sun. You've missed her, he said, and I wasn't here to notice. The truth of it pricked at her, tender and vulnerable. She brushed her thumb along the edge of the photograph, grounding herself. I don't know if this can work, she whispered. I don't either, he admitted. But I want to learn. When she looked up again, his gaze was steady, not pleading, just open in a way she hadn't seen since the earliest days. And yet, the question lingered. Fragile as the candle flame between them, could one choice a single, unexpected moment of presence rewrite years of emotional distance? Claire wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. Healing didn't arrive with speeches or promises. It began the next morning, in the soft clink of two mugs on the kitchen island. Claire stood by the window, still in her robe, watching the early Seattle mist drift across the bay. The light was gentle, the kind that didn't demand anything, just existed. She held her coffee between both hands, letting the warmth settle into her palms. She wasn't expecting anything from the morning. Not change, not clarity, just quiet. Behind her. She heard Michael open a cabinet, then close it again too softly, as if afraid even the sound might scare her back into distance. Creamer's on the left. Right? He asked. The question was simple, but it tugged at something deep in her chest. He hadn't asked about her coffee in months. He used to know how she liked it. He used to care. It's in the drawer, she said gently, not turning around yet. I moved it. He nodded, even though she couldn't see it. She heard him reach for it, pour carefully, then hesitate. That hesitation was new, like he was learning her all over again, not assuming familiarity, but choosing attentiveness. When he finally stepped beside her, offering the mug, she accepted it. Their fingers brushed, brief but real. It was the kind of moment couples build entire lifetimes from, but only when both people noticed. He cleared his throat. I thought maybe we could start the day together. The words weren't smooth, they weren't confident, and that alone made them feel honest. Claire sipped, letting the coffee warm the edges of her morning. We can try, she said softly. He sat beside her. They didn't talk much, and for once, silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like space being gently reclaimed. Later that afternoon, she walked to the small community clinic a few blocks away. The air smelled of rain and cold pine, and the clouds hung low over the city with heavy gray shoulders. As she stepped inside the clinic, surrounded by soft chatter and scuffed floors, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: purpose. The director, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, recognized her background immediately. Art therapy. We could use that, even part-time. Part-time. The word felt safe, manageable, something she could hold without fear of losing herself again. On her way home, Claire stopped by a small bakery for a sandwich and looked at her phone twice, not because she expected disappointment, but because habit had trained her to anticipate absence. Yet, there were no missed calls, no texts, just stillness. When she opened the condo door, she found Michael sitting at the dining table, a stack of documents open. But instead of being absorbed in them, he pushed them aside as soon as he saw her step in. "You're home," he said, as though the words still surprised him. "I am." She slipped off her coat, her voice gentle. "How was your day?" He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. "Different. I talked to my assistant. I blocked off evenings from now on. No meetings after 5. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she hung her coat carefully on the rack, letting the meaning of his words settle. A few months ago, such a declaration might have sounded like an empty promise. Tonight, it felt like the quiet start of something steadier. "That's good," she finally said. They took a short walk that evening, hands brushing occasionally like shy teenagers. The crisp air pinched their cheeks. The waterfront lights shimmered in the puddles along the walkway. Footsteps echoed softly between them. At one point, he slowed near the railing. "I've been trying to figure out why I let everything get so far away from us." She didn't push him, didn't fill the silence with answers. She just waited. He leaned on the cold metal rail, watching the ferry glide across the water. "I think I got used to being needed at work. It felt clearer than being needed at home." "That must have been lonely," she said quietly. He exhaled, the breath shaky. "I didn't know how lonely until you weren't beside me." The confession was small, almost swallowed by the wind, but sincere enough to reach her. She had needed to hear him name it, not just the distance, but the loss he felt because of it. When they returned to the condo, she took out her phone, more from habit than intention. She hovered her thumb over the camera icon, hesitating. He noticed. "You want a picture?" he asked softly. She shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. Maybe not. I don't know." He stepped closer, leaving the choice entirely with her. No pressure, just presence. After a long moment, she opened the camera. He leaned in, the faintest smile touching his lips. Not posed or polished, just warm. They both looked at the screen. The image wasn't perfect. Her hair was mussed from the wind. His collar was uneven. The lighting was terrible. But it felt real. She pressed the shutter. The soft click echoed in her chest more deeply than she expected. It wasn't a declaration, not a milestone, just a moment, a small ritual of us. She saved the photo, but didn't post it anywhere. It was enough that it existed. Michael watched her face as she tucked the phone away. "Does it feel too soon?" he asked, not accusing, just curious. She shook her head. "No, it feels careful. And maybe that's what we need." He nodded slowly, as though the word careful was something he could hold on to. As they cleaned up the kitchen together, another ritual they hadn't shared in months, the quiet between them felt warmer than any of the grand gestures he'd attempted in the past. And yet, as she wiped the counter, a question found its way into her mind, soft but persistent. Could they keep this tenderness alive when routine returned, or would it fade like so many promises before she didn't ask it aloud? Not yet. Claire didn't expect to see him the moment she pushed open the clinic's break room door. Yet there he was, standing awkwardly beside the dented refrigerator, holding 2 brown paper lunch bags like he wasn't sure which hand belonged to which. For a second, she simply froze, her fingers still curled around the door handle. The afternoon sun slanted through the narrow window, cutting a soft line across his face. He looked almost out of place in his pressed shirt and polished shoes, surrounded by chipped counters and mismatched chairs. But something in his posture, shoulders slightly hunched, gaze unsure, softened the distance she'd been guarding. I wasn't sure what you liked from that cafe down the street, he said, so I guessed. And then I guessed again. She glanced at the bags. One had her name scribbled on it in his handwriting, messy and uneven, like he hadn't written anything by hand in ages. You showed up, she murmured. He nodded, a little breathless, as if arriving here had required more courage than he expected. I wanted to see where you spend your days now. The clinic wasn't impressive by any measure. The chairs wobbled, the paint peeled near the windows, and the old coffee maker rattled whenever it warmed up. But it was hers, a place she chose, not a life she was absorbed into. Seeing him here, standing in the middle of it, stirred something warm and uncertain in her chest. They sat at the small round table. He unpacked the lunches carefully, lining up the sandwiches, chips, and cookies as though arranging proof that he'd tried. You didn't have to do this, she said softly. I know. He met her eyes, steady for once. That's why I wanted to. They ate quietly for a few minutes. Outside, she could hear children laughing in the waiting room, a nurse calling names, the steady hum of life at the clinic. It contrasted strangely with the intimate stillness at their table. She felt exposed and grounded at the same time. Your office must be wondering where you are, she said lightly. Probably, he replied, but I'm not wondering where I should be. She looked down at her sandwich, the corners of her lips tightening. Michael? This feels good, but I'm still scared. He didn't push back. He didn't sigh. He just leaned forward a little, elbows on the table, his voice quiet. Tell me. She hesitated, tracing the rim of her cup with one finger. I don't want to disappear again. I don't want to feel like background noise in my own marriage. His throat moved in a slow swallow. He interlaced his fingers, unclasped them, then tried again. His hands shook slightly, not from anger, but vulnerability. She wasn't used to seeing him like this. I didn't realize how far I'd drifted, he said, or how many times you reached for me and I wasn't there. Claire breathed in carefully, the words settling deep into her. I kept trying to remind you we were still a we, but everything became later. They sat with the truth for a moment. It wasn't dramatic or loud, just heavy in the quiet way only honesty could be. Through the half-open door, they heard footsteps and distant conversation. A nurse passed by, offering Claire a warm smile. She smiled back, then turned to Michael again. You said you wanted to see where I spend my days, she said gently. What do you think? He looked around the chipped walls, the faded posters, the small bookshelf with art supplies stacked unevenly. I think it looks like a place where people matter, he said, and I think I forgot how to make people matter. The admission caught her off guard. She blinked, unsure how to respond. He leaned back, exhaling. Success is loud. Claire. It fills every room, demands every moment. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could protect us, give us something solid. But somewhere along the way, it became easier to listen to the noise outside than to the quiet inside our home. She watched him, really watched him, as he struggled to form the next words. His eyes shifted toward the window, the sunlight catching the lines at their corners. I'm scared too, he finally whispered. Scared of failing you, of trying and not being enough, of learning how to love in a way that doesn't come naturally to me. Her breath caught. She had waited years for something like this, not perfection, not grand promises, just the truth spoken without armor. She reached out slowly, resting her hand near his on the table, not touching yet, but close enough to feel the warmth. "It's not about perfect," she said. "I just need to feel seen. I need to feel like you choose us, not out of guilt, but because we matter to you." He nodded, his gaze lowering to their almost touching hands. "I want to choose us," he said softly. "I just don't know if you believe that yet." She didn't answer immediately. Her throat tightened, and she swallowed hard. "I want to believe it," she said finally. "But belief takes time." He accepted that quietly, as though the patience she asked for wasn't a burden, but a direction. When lunch ended, he helped her throw away the wrappers, wiped the small crumbs from the table, then lingered by the door as she walked him back toward the lobby. He paused before stepping out, his hand braced gently against the doorframe. "Can we keep talking like this?" he asked. "Even when it's hard?" She nodded, felt the sincerity of it. "We can try." He smiled small, vulnerable, almost shy, and stepped outside. The door closed softly behind him, the glass catching his reflection for a moment before the afternoon light washed it away. Claire stood there, feeling the echo of their conversation settle inside her like a fragile spark. Part of her lifted with hope. Another part trembled with fear. Could honesty really become the ground they'd rebuild from? She didn't know. Not yet. The lake looked almost silver in the early morning light, a wide, still sheet that caught every passing cloud like a mirror too delicate to touch. Claire stood on the small wooden porch of the cabin, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the faint ripples fold into each other. She heard the soft creak of the cabin door behind her, followed by steady footsteps she knew too well. Michael stepped out, rubbing his arms against the cool air. "You're up early," he said. She didn't turn right away. She let the quiet settle between them, a quiet that, for once, didn't feel strained. "Couldn't sleep," she murmured. The lake was calling. He moved beside her, leaving just enough space for choice. Not too close, not too far. The kind of distance that said he was trying. "I made coffee," he said. "It might actually be drinkable this time." She smiled at that small, involuntary, "I'll be the judge." He handed her his mug, and she took a sip. It was a little bitter, a little burnt, but warm in a way that mattered more than flavor. "I like it," she said. He studied her expression, unsure whether to believe her, then let out a low breath. "I'm glad." The cabin they had rented sat tucked between tall pines, its roof dotted with leftover pine needles and its porch overlooking a narrow, winding trail. It wasn't far from Seattle, but far enough that the noise of their usual lives felt muted. They hadn't traveled here to escape each other, just to find the parts they'd misplaced. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and old quilts. After breakfast, they moved slowly through the space, unsure of how to fill the hours. It was Claire who finally broke the quiet. "Will you help me chop the vegetables?" He blinked at her as though she had offered him a test. "I can try." She handed him an onion. He stared at it as though it were more challenge than instruction. "Just cut it in half," she said gently. He did, and nearly sent half of it rolling off the counter. Claire laughed softly, surprising herself. "You know, most people use a cutting board." He looked down, embarrassed, then joined her laughter in a quiet, unpolished way. It felt strangely intimate, this shared awkwardness in a tiny cabin kitchen. As they cooked, the room filled with the simple sounds of knives against wood, spoons scraping pans, the gentle simmering of soup on the stove. Michael moved cautiously at first, watching her more than the tasks he attempted, but slowly he found small rhythms, handing her spices without being asked, stirring when she stopped to taste the broth. "Did you cook much growing up?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not really. My mother didn't like anyone in her kitchen, or in her space, or..." Close. Claire noticed the way his shoulders pulled inward at the memory. She set down the spoon, leaning against the counter. You don't have to talk about anything you're not ready for. He nodded once, but continued anyway. It's not that I don't care. Claire, his voice softened. I just never learned how to show it. My mother kept everything tidy, controlled. Feelings were treated like clutter. The soup bubbled quietly between them. Claire spoke gently. I think part of you learned to survive by staying small, staying quiet. He looked at her with a mixture of surprise and grief, as though she'd opened a door he'd been pushing closed for decades. She turned back to the stove. I spent my childhood the opposite way. My dad was everywhere. Loud laugh, loud footsteps, always tinkering with something. When he passed, her breath caught briefly. The silence felt like losing oxygen. He listened without interrupting, really listened, his gaze softening. That's why presence matters so much to me, she said. Not gifts, not gestures, just someone who's there. Michael stepped closer, drawn by something deeper than intention. I didn't know that, he said quietly. I should have asked. I should have done so many things differently. She shook her head. You can't change what you didn't understand. He stood there for a long moment, the warmth of the kitchen circling them like a fragile truce. Then he spoke, voice low but steady. I want to learn, he said. I want to learn how to love in a way you can feel. Her breath tightened at the words unexpected, earnest, and trembling at the edges. She held the edge of the counter to ground herself. Michael, she whispered. He reached out as if to touch her arm, then stopped, letting the choice stay with her. She let her hand drift closer to his, not touching, but close enough that the warmth bridged the small gap. I'm trying, he said softly. I see that, she replied. The soup simmered behind them, filling the small space with the scent of onion and thyme. Outside, the lake flickered with late afternoon light, and the pines swayed in a slow, comforting rhythm. They ate at the small wooden table by the window, talking not about the future, not about promises, but about memories, her daughter's first day of college, his childhood bedroom with its 2 neat shelves, the way life could surprise them even after 40. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't a miracle, but it was closer than they had been in years. As the sun dipped lower, casting gold across the lake, Claire watched Michael gather the dishes. He moved awkwardly, a man trying to learn the choreography of intimacy he'd forgotten how to dance. She felt something warm settle at the base of her heart, hope mixed with caution. Could this version of him last? Could this gentleness survive the weight of old habits? She didn't know the answer as she watched him at the sink, sleeves rolled, water splashing softly. She only knew that, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't bracing herself against disappointment, but hope, real hope, was a fragile thing. And as the evening deepened, a quiet question hovered in the air between them. Was wanting enough? The sound of a single chime, barely audible. Barely anything broke the rhythm of the evening. Claire heard it from the hallway the moment she hung her coat on the hook. It came from his office down the corridor, a soft alert. Then the muffled shift of his chair. She paused, her breath catching in the quiet. They had dinner plans. 7 o'clock, a small Italian place 2 blocks away, the kind with candles on every table, and a waiter who remembered her order from years back. She had been looking forward to it all day, maybe more than she'd admitted even to herself. She glanced at the clock, 7:18 p.m. Michael, she called gently. No response, just the faint click of keys being pressed, one after another, quick and urgent like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. She walked toward the cracked open door, her steps soft on the hallway rug. The office light spilled out in a cold, bright rectangle. She pushed the door with 2 fingers and found him leaning toward the screen, jaw tight, eyes locked in concentration. He looked like the man she used to watch from across dinner tables gone cold. She stood there for a moment, waiting for him to notice her. When he finally did, it was with a startled inhale, as though she had broken a spell. "Oh, Claire," he said, blinking. "I didn't hear you come in." She tried to smile. It trembled. "We were supposed to leave at 7. His face drained. "I'm God. I'm sorry. Something came up at the company. A supply chain issue overseas. I just needed to." She waited for the sentence to end, but it didn't. His eyes kept flicking back to the screen, even as he spoke to her. Something inside her tightened. Old, familiar, sharp. "You just needed to," what she asked quietly. Michael closed the laptop slowly, as though wrestling himself away from it, to put out a small fire. "I should have texted. I don't know. I wasn't thinking. The worst part wasn't the missed dinner. It was the way the past 5 months echoed through the moment every forgotten evening, every apology that arrived too late, every time she sat in a restaurant pretending she didn't care that he wasn't coming. She stepped back a little, giving herself air. "I got ready," she said, her voice steady but thin. "I waited. I thought, after everything, tonight mattered." "It does," he said quickly. "Claire, it really does." But his words came out rushed, like he was still half inside the crisis he'd been handling. She wrapped her arms across her stomach, grounding herself. "You told me you'd be present. I know, and I meant it, but you weren't." Her reflection in the office window looked faint, ghost-like, as if she were watching someone else's disappointment. She hated that feeling, the slip from hope to hurt, the familiar drop in her chest. Michael stood, running a hand through his hair. "I messed up. It was one call, one issue. I didn't choose work over you. I just reacted." She held his gaze. "That's how it starts." He swallowed hard. "You think I'm slipping back." "Are you?" she whispered. He stepped toward her, then stopped, fear flickering in his eyes. Not fear of losing face, fear of losing her. "I don't want to go back to that version of me," he said. "I'm trying. I'm really trying." She looked down at her hands. "Trying is good, Michael, but trying doesn't erase the impact." The silence stretched, long and taut. He couldn't find a defense that didn't sound like an excuse. She couldn't find comfort in a pattern that once defined her loneliness. He exhaled shakily. "Tell me what you're feeling." She lifted her eyes to him, hurt, raw, no shield left. "I can forgive mistakes," she said, her voice soft but unshakable. "But I can't relive neglect." The sentence landed with a heavy, undeniable weight. He closed his eyes for a moment, his breath unsteady, as though she had pinpointed the very place he feared most. "I'm not neglecting you," he said, almost pleading. "I just forgot." She finished for him. "And I know forgetting isn't intentional, but it still hurts the same." He took another step toward her, gentler this time. "Please don't pull away." She felt her chest tighten with that familiar instinct to retreat before she broke. But another instinct pulled at her too, the hope she'd slowly rebuilt, the connection they'd fought for these last weeks. "I'm not pulling away," she said. "I'm telling you where the line is. I can't pretend small slips don't mean something. They always meant something." His shoulders slumped. "I don't want to lose what we've rebuilt." "Then show me," she whispered. "Show me this isn't the start of the old rhythm returning." He looked at her as if searching for permission to make it right. She didn't give it, not yet, not in words. She simply stepped back further, letting the space speak. She turned toward the hallway. "I'm going to take a walk," she said softly. "I need to breathe." He nodded, helpless. "Will you come back?" She paused at the threshold, the ache deep and real. "I haven't left," she said, "but I need to see that you're here, too." Then she walked out, closing the door gently behind her. The sound echoed through the condo, soft, not angry, but full of a question neither of them could yet answer. Was this the start of breaking again, or the moment they learned how to stay? Michael stood inside his office long before anyone else arrived, the early light filtering through the tall glass windows in thin, pale stripes. The city below was just waking, brake lights flickering along the wet streets. He hadn't slept much. His mind had replayed Claire's words over and over, each repetition sharpening their truth instead of numbing it. I can forgive mistakes. I can't relive neglect. He let the sentence settle inside him again, not resisting it this time. It wasn't an accusation. It was a boundary one she had every right to draw. He walked to his desk and placed both hands on its cool surface. Then, with a slow breath, he did something he'd never done in his entire career. He opened his laptop, hovered over his overflowing calendar, and began deleting. The first meeting vanished from his schedule. Then, the second. Then, an entire block of evening calls dissolved like mist. He heard the faint knock on the door just as he eliminated a Friday night planning session he'd guarded religiously for years. Carolyn, his assistant, stepped in with her usual stack of reports. She stopped short when she saw the calendar on his screen, whole chunks disappearing under his fingertips. Sir, are we rescheduling the board prep? Yes, Michael said quietly, not looking up. All of it. She blinked as if she hadn't heard him correctly. All of it. He leaned back, folding his arms, more certain than he felt. I'm reassigning half my workload. Marcus can take the product rollout. Finance can handle the audit without me breathing over their shoulders. Carolyn hesitated, and the late-night calls with Singapore. No more late-night calls, he said. Set boundaries. Tell them I'm available during Seattle hours only. She stared at him, stunned, with respect. That's not how you've run this company. He allowed himself a small, steady nod. I know. Carolyn studied him for a moment, saw the resolve, not frustration, not burnout, but something deeper. Do you need support reorganizing everything? Yes, he admitted. And thank you. She softened. Good. It's about time you took a breath. When she left, closing the door behind her, the office fell into a soft, almost reverent silence. Michael sank into his chair, letting the decision settle. It felt strange, liberating, terrifying, deeply uncomfortable. His life had always been built around structure, achievement, relentless forward motion. He had never paused long enough to consider who might be trying to keep pace beside him. A few hours later, he stood before the board. The long mahogany table gleamed beneath the overhead lights, and a dozen expectant faces watched him as though waiting for battle strategies. Instead, he spoke calmly. I'm restructuring my involvement, effective immediately. I'm reducing my hours to something sustainable. The company will not suffer. Our team is capable, and it's time I stop acting as if I'm the only one who can hold the roof up. Murmurs rolled across the room. A few raised brows, a few looks of disbelief. One board member cleared his throat. Is everything all right at home? Michael, he didn't bristle, didn't hide. Things are finally in motion, he said. I just need to be present enough not to break what's healing. There was a pause, then a slow nod from around the table. Eventually, approval. Eventually, understanding. When he walked out of the building, the afternoon air met him with a soft breeze, carrying the scent of damp pine from the street. He took the long way to the parking garage, letting the moment settle in, layers fear, hope, humility, all bound together. For the first time in years, he left work while the sun was still up. He drove home without the usual tightness in his chest, though nerves pulsed under each breath. He didn't know what Claire would say. He didn't know if he'd already damaged too much. He only knew that the change he'd made wasn't for show. It was for survival. The survival of their marriage, yes, but also the survival of the man he wanted to become. When he stepped into the condo, he found her in the kitchen, rinsing a mug in the sink. She looked up when she heard his steps, eyes cautious but not closed. You're home early, she said, drying her hands on a towel. I am, he replied softly. She nodded, waiting, not leaning away, not leaning in, letting him show who he was now. I made changes today, he said, real ones, not the kind that fade when things get busy. She didn't move, but he felt something shift in the air, subtle as a leaf turning. What kind of changes he told her about the reassignments, the boundaries, the conversation with the board. He didn't embellish, didn't offer the words proudly, but plainly, the way truth should be spoken. Her eyes softened, but uncertainty lingered around the edges, delicate as frost. "That sounds big," she said quietly. "It is," he admitted, "and it scares me. But losing you scares me more." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The kitchen was still, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft rain starting again outside. Michael inhaled slowly. "Claire, I can't erase what I did. I can't undo the nights you ate alone or the mornings I made you feel invisible. But I can start again. I can meet you now with both feet in, not one in the office and one at home." Her breath hitched, just slightly. He saw it. "I want a fresh start," he whispered. "If you'll have it. Not a reset, just a chance to build better." He didn't reach for her. He let the space stay open, respectful. Then, to his quiet disbelief, she moved first. Her hand small, warm, steady slipped into his. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a perfect kiss or a sweeping declaration. It was something far more intimate. A choice. She looked up at him, eyes cautious but open. "I want to believe this," she said. "I want us to try from a place that's honest, not desperate." He nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Then, that's where we'll start." The rain outside deepened, tapping against the windows like a gentle drumbeat, marking the beginning of a rhythm they hadn't yet learned but were willing to try. Claire squeezed his hand once, a soft question. What does love look like now when it is built on truth, not illusion? And neither of them had the answer yet, but for the first time, they were willing to find it together. The knock came on a bright Saturday afternoon, light spilling across the living room like soft linen laid out to dry. Claire looked up from the dining table just as laughter swelled from the kitchen. Her daughter, Emily, teasing Michael about chopping vegetables too slowly. The warmth of it filled the entire condo, the kind of warmth that once felt impossible. Another knock, a familiar voice. Grocery delivery. Claire smiled before she even reached the door. Jake stood there, older by a handful of months, but still wearing the same easy, earnest grin. A gust of spring air followed him as he lifted the paper bags with a small flourish. "Well," he said, his eyes widening playfully as he heard Emily's laughter from inside. "Sounds like someone's having a much better birthday season this time around." "It's not my birthday," Claire laughed, taking the bags from him. "Could have fooled me," he said. "Joy's kinda loud." She blushed, not from embarrassment but from the gentle truth of it. Michael stepped into the entryway then, wiping his hands on a towel. Jake straightened a little when he saw him, as if unsure how formal to be. But Michael only smiled a calm, steady smile that had grown easier on him lately. "Jake," he said, offering his hand. "I never got to say thank you." Jake blinked. "For the delivery? No." Michael replied, his voice low and sincere. "For being an unexpected mirror. One we clearly needed." The young man looked confused for a beat, then softened. "I'm glad things, turned out okay." "They're turning," Claire corrected gently. "Every day." Jake nodded. "That's the best kind." He left with a bright wave, and Claire closed the door, leaning her back against it for a moment. The condo sounded different now. Voices, footsteps, the aroma of onions browning and warm bread rising from the oven. Living things, shared things. Emily popped her head around the corner. "Mom, he's butchering the carrots. Please come supervise." Michael's distant protest drifted into the hallway. "They're abstractly cut. It's a style." Claire laughed and walked toward them, the wooden floor warm beneath her feet. For a suspended moment, she watched them before entering the kitchen, her grown daughter rolling her eyes. Michael trying far too hard to look competent, sunlight touching the side of his face in a way that made him seem both older and gentler. She stepped in beside him and touched his arm lightly. "The key is to breathe," she teased. He smiled, the kind that reached all the way to his eyes now. "I'm learning." Later, with the table set and dinner underway, a simple meal. But theirs, the conversation flowed in soft waves. Emily talked about school, about a new friend, about the clinic where she volunteered. Michael listened, asking questions, really being there. It was not grand, it was not flashy, but to Claire, the ordinary felt like a newly discovered treasure. After dinner, as Emily washed dishes and hummed an old tune Claire used to play in the car years ago, Michael stepped onto the balcony. The evening had settled over Seattle in hues of amber and blue, the skyline glowing softly like lanterns placed across the horizon. Claire joined him, wrapping a cardigan around her shoulders as the cool air brushed her arms. Michael leaned on the railing beside her. "It feels different," he murmured. "What has she asked?" "This," he said, gesturing gently toward the condo behind them. "Us, the quiet, the ease." She nodded. "It's been earned." He turned to her, his expression tender. "Thank you for giving me the chance to earn it." Claire breathed out slowly, a breath that carried months of tension finally released. She reached for his hand, or perhaps they both reached at once. It was hard to tell. They stood like that for a while, watching the fading light over the bay. Then Michael glanced at her with a small, almost shy smile. "Take a picture with me." Claire raised an eyebrow. "A selfie. Seems we owe that tradition a better one." She laughed softly. "All right, but no filters, no posing, just us." He agreed. She held up her phone. Michael stepped closer, not with the eagerness of a man trying to impress, but the steadiness of someone grateful simply to share a frame with her. The camera captured nothing dramatic, no perfect angles, no polished smiles, just two adults with weathered hearts choosing to stand together again. The click was quiet, but somehow it echoed. They looked at the photo, its imperfections brighter than anything staged. "That's nice," Michael said. "It's real," Claire replied, and the truth of it lingered gently between them. A moment later, both of their phones buzzed at the same time, sharp, familiar vibrations breaking the peaceful air. They each glanced down work emails, marked urgent. Claire felt her breath hitch, just slightly. Old instincts tugged, preparing for the flinch, the apology, the pivot away. But Michael let his phone dim without opening it. He placed it face down on the patio table. "You don't have to," she whispered. "I want to," he answered. She mirrored him, setting her phone beside his. Two small rectangles of glass going silent together. Inside, Emily started laughing at something on the television. The sound floated toward them like a warm tide. Claire leaned into Michael's side, not because she needed to, because she chose to. They watched the city lights shimmer against the water, their joined silhouettes reflected faintly in the balcony door, a quiet portrait of two people who had fought their way back to one another, not through perfection, but through presence. And Claire wondered, not for the first time, if the greatest turning points in life really did begin with a moment you never meant to share. She didn't have the answer, but maybe the question was enough. Sometimes, healing begins in the smallest, quietest places long before we notice it happening. It might be a single kind gesture, a difficult conversation, or the moment we finally admit what has been hurting us for years. Life rarely shifts in grand, dramatic scenes. More often, it softens in the corners, in the pauses, in the choices we make when no one is watching. If there's one truth woven gently through their story, it's this: love isn't proven by the extraordinary. It's proven by the ordinary we choose to show up for. The dinners we keep, the eyes we meet, the moments we stay, even when it would be easier to run back into old habits. And sometimes, the bravest thing two adults can do is try again, not because they forgot the pain, but because they finally understand it. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of second chances. Not perfection, not promises carved in stone, just two people deciding, day after day, to see each other a little more clearly and to love with a little more intention. If you're standing at a crossroads of your own, I hope you give yourself permission to choose what brings you peace. Thank you for spending a little of your time here with this story tonight. Your presence truly matters, More than you know, it's what keeps these quiet human moments alive. If the story touched you in any way, a like, a share, or a subscribe is a gentle way to help more hearts find their way to it. Wishing you warmth, calm, and a soft place to land wherever you are.